All right, good afternoon. Thanks for attending today's webinar about cloud readiness in higher education. Higher education is experiencing historic rates of evolution and transformation brought on in part by rapidly changing technology, which can lead to changes in systems, data, processes, and more for organizations. Cloud systems have transformed multiple industries, and higher education is no exception. My name is Lee Bush, and I'm a Director of Business Development with Avaap. We have a great session ahead today, led by Avaap Vice President Tim Oberschlake. Tim is a leader with significant experience with cloud transformations, advising colleges and universities on their journeys. Additionally, before joining Avaap, Tim was also a CIO, so he has a unique ability to see things both from the client side as well as an advisor and consultant. Before I hand things over to Tim, though, I wanted to point out that if anybody has a question, feel free to submit it at the question box at the bottom at any time during the webinar, and we'll be sure to answer those questions at the end. And then lastly, an online version of today's webinar will be available on our website in approximately 2 business days. And then everybody who's registered for the webinar will also receive an email with a link to view the webinar on demand. So let's get started, Tim.
All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Lee. I appreciate it. And I'm glad to see everybody joining us. I can see the attendee list continuing to populate there. So again, we appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. As Lee talked about, we're really going to be focusing today on defining what the cloud is, what to expect from the cloud, how do we get to the cloud, selecting the right ERP solution, and really at the end, a little bit of maybe how Avaap can help, but that's going to be the last thing we'll be talking through. Again, as Lee had indicated, we really want to make this interactive at the end. So if you have questions, feel free to put those in there. And I'll apologize up front. Obviously, we're doing this webinar via Zoom. If I have a dog in the background bark, that's the world we live in today. So hopefully that doesn't happen, but it may, just to give you that heads up. So let's go ahead and jump right in. The first thing we're going to be talking about is what is the cloud? Now, that obviously seems like a pretty simplistic question, but it's interesting because when you talk to the vendors in the cloud ERP space, they start defining what cloud is in ways that benefits them in the eyes of their potential clients or prospects. So you really have to sort of be careful a little bit about your definitions and what truly you're looking for in a cloud ERP solution. So when we're talking cloud, we're talking either a public or private cloud, something that's out there on the internet. It can be on, AWS, which would be, more of a public type setting. It can be a private cloud, Workday, Oracle, and in those type of situations, you'd be, going into their infrastructure to access their systems. But the bottom line is when we're talking about cloud, we're talking about things that aren't on your premise, taking that infrastructure, if you will, and taking it into the cloud space so you can start focusing on the things that are strategic to you, teaching and learning, and not necessarily focusing on technology, infrastructure, which can be done, for you by these multiple vendors in the cloud ERP space. So let's talk a little bit about terminology. You often hear in the cloud ERP space the term software as a service. And some people say, well, we're in the cloud, we're a SaaS provider. Well, software as a service really has everything to do with how your software is licensed to you. It really doesn't dictate your cloud approach. So when I'm talking about that, you're really dealing with a subscription to the software with a SaaS model. So every month or whatever your contract, every quarter, whatever your contract dictates, you're going to be charged a certain amount of money, for the service of your software. And that's going to happen every month or every year, every quarter, however it's in your contract. And again, you've seen examples of this and with the Microsoft Office, things like that, with Salesforce, if you've done any work on that platform. But the bottom line is the cloud ERP space, all of the vendors are going to this SaaS model, but that isn't the way cloud is delivered. When you're looking at cloud, you're really looking at something called multi-tenant, single tenant. Sometimes you hear that called isolated tenant, or multi-instance hosted. And there's a real big difference between each of those. A multi-tenant SaaS infrastructure in the cloud space is really, I think, what most vendors are really trying to get to. And the bottom line is what that really means is that you have a shared application layer across your application, okay, in a multi-tenant cloud space. And that means the same application you're working with is the same exact application that some other person is working with. Now, you also get folks that are single tenant or isolated tenant, very similar. The difference there, though, is that your application layer is actually, instead of being shared by all clients, it's actually isolated to you in your own environment. Now, most of the folks, and I'll use Oracle as an example here, that are isolated tenant, they still have the same, type of situation where they do release management, et cetera. They make sure that they're in Oracle's case, quarterly releases are getting managed there, so everyone's on the same application suite. But the bottom line is you're really not on the same application layer maybe as another solution provider. Like, again, if you were in a situation with, and I'll use Workday as an example, that's a multi-tenant SaaS infrastructure application layer shared across across all their clients. And again, there's pros and cons on some of this, and that's something you have to look at. But I just want to make sure you understand that all cloud ERP systems are not built alike. And you see some entrance into this space actually doing what we'll call hosted or multi-instance type cloud. And what we really mean there is what they're doing is they're taking their on-premise infrastructure and they're basically putting it into a hosted type infrastructure where it's shared on a server. And that's no different than you having an on-premise implementation, just moving it to a different data center. And a lot of folks are starting to look at that type of cloud infrastructure and calling it a cloud ERP system. But again, there's significant differences with that architecture, and that leads to differences in the way you're supported. So again, Oracle and Workday typically compete very heavily in this cloud ERP space in higher education, and they're in that multi-tenant, isolated tenant space. The folks that aren't in that space, can they do releases, where they give you a period of time to look at it before you actually take the release, for example, or that's in production, so you can actually give feedback, and if something's not working, have some time to fix it. Those type of things are really important. How you manage the releases, how you manage your environments, how you manage your tenants is really dictated by what that infrastructure looks like. So again, with that as the backdrop, and that got very technical. I apologize for the folks on the phone that may not be as technical, more application centric, but I thought it was important to understand up front that not all systems are built equally. Not everyone that claims to be cloud truly is a multi-tenant or an isolated tenant type of architecture, okay? So what to expect with the cloud? Really, when we look at the benefits of a cloud system, we really start focusing on some of that infrastructure we talked about. You're taking that infrastructure you had to support, previously in an on-premise environment, and you're taking that and moving to the cloud, and all of a sudden your vendor with strong service level agreements is now responsible for your backups. It's responsible for, the server infrastructure. It's responsible for all of that you would typically house in your data center. So now, instead of really being an IT focused shop, you can actually then focus on the applications in particular and not necessarily on that technical infrastructure. And again, there's some benefits listed on the screen. I won't read all those, but that type of infrastructure and that pre-built application layer actually allows organizations to get up on the systems quicker and faster than traditional ERP systems. It allows you a lot of flexibility going forward, to add additional functionality in the future without having to worry about what release someone's on. And again, I'll take the other side of that from a vendor perspective. Folks like Workday and Oracle, now they can spend their time focused on building the application rather than figuring out and supporting 5, 6, 7 releases of an application across myriad of clients. It's everybody's on the same one. Now they can focus their attention on actually product development instead of basically release support, which is a big deal because now they can basically turn functionality to you in a much quicker fashion. So again, all those type of benefits is really what you can expect from the cloud. Now, let's talk a little bit about your implementation strategy with cloud. And this is really important because, as I said, typically in cloud, you have an application layer that's basically shared by many, many different clients. Whether you're multi-tenant, isolated tenant, the bottom line is that in those situations, that application layer that's used at one university is the same application that's being used all over the country with folks that have that same software. So when you think about that, that means that you're not unique, okay? It used to be in the ERP space that you go into an institution and this is the way we do things at X university, okay? And we need to make sure our system operates the way we do things. And I think the flip that we have here with Cloud ERP is, yes, these systems are highly configurable, okay, but really what you want to do with these systems is undergo business transformation. So in other words, why can't we process an invoice at institution A the same way we do institution B? There is absolutely no reason. And I think the question that you have to ask yourselves when you're looking at this is, what's strategic for our organization? Those things that are strategic for your organization are the things that you need to be focusing your time and attention on. And that means, potentially how we're doing teaching, how we're learning, our research, and depending on the size of the institution. Those may actually differentiate you from another university down the street or in your conference or what have you. How you process an invoice typically is not. So those tactical items all of a sudden become commonplace, if you will. And if we have a best practice way to do those things, there's absolutely no reason going forward, that we can't actually all come to that best practice business process and transform our institution to do it that way in lieu of continuing to do things the way we've always done it. So when we talk our implementation strategy in the cloud, we're really focused on going to that best practice, transforming your business to basically do things the way you would do it in higher education in the best possible way, not necessarily, as it says here, repaving the cow path you've always had, okay? Now, a couple other differences, with the cloud. Again, if you basically have the same application at institution A and B as we talked about, the bottom line is when you look at that, you can configure that system for some special things, compliance things, there's a lot of configuration you can do, your job codes, etc. You can configure the system, but what you can't do is you can't customize the system. Now, there are vendors that have what they call platform as a service. Matter of fact, again, Workday and Oracle are the two biggies that are out there competing in the space typically. And the bottom line is they have a platform as a service offering where you can extend the functionality of their applications. However, we really never suggest that you use something like that to continue to do things the way you've always done them. That shouldn't be the focus. When you go into a project like this, you're really thinking about, again, going to best practice, configuring things, again, for your institution specifically, how your job codes work, et cetera. There's going to be some things there that you can figure, but you really should be focusing on not customizing. So we say vanilla in lieu of swirl. You really should be doing vanilla implementations in the cloud, and you should not be trying to customize. As a matter of fact, in most of these, actually in Workday and Oracle, you can't customize the system, okay? So you really are only able to configure. So you have to come to that best practice, all right? And the other thing that we would say here is there's a big difference on really your participation or approach during an implementation, okay? Now, what we have shown here on this diagram is sort of a testing approach, if you will. And we won't spend a whole lot of time on that diagram, but the key issue here is if you have a pre-built application with best practice, okay, and you can quickly stand that up into a tenant, which happens when you start, an implementation. The bottom line is you can actually get the functional users actually engaged with the application right at the beginning of the project. So when you do your discovery, when you do your initial design sessions or architect sessions, when you do those type of things, you can actually be viewing the actual software. Now, that's a big departure from traditional ERP implementations. In those situations, what traditionally happened is you would come in and people would basically meet, the technical team would meet with these functional users. You get this whole list of requirements. And with that list of requirements, you go out, you build what they want, and then you come back and show them. And that may be 6 months later, 5 months later, 7 months later, whatever it is. Well, that functional engagement obviously is missing. And as you could probably tell from, I'm not sure if you guys have heard the telephone game, you basically say something in the telephone to someone, they say something to someone else. By the time it gets 10 different calls down the line, it completely sounds different than what it originally meant. The same thing happens when you're doing requirement gathering and when you're actually trying to meet that requirement for a functional user. You may not always get it exactly what they thought you were going to be doing. And that lack of engagement for 6 or 7 months is a big distraction on traditional ERP implementation. So in the cloud, you're getting people involved functionally right away, and you're involving them in the process right away. And throughout that project, they're interacting with the software all the time. Okay, so it's just a much different type of look and feel for a project when you're doing a cloud ERP implementation. It's functionally driven. They're no longer technology projects, and they shouldn't be approached that way. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about getting to the cloud. We talked about the differences within within a cloud implementation as an example. We do things in an iterative manner. I'm not sure I mentioned that, but when you're doing an implementation, that's sort of the way you do it, one prototype at a time, if you will. So there's that high touch, all right? Now, when we actually talk about where are you at today, what do you need to do to get to that point where you're doing a cloud ERP, there's several items that you have to basically get ready for. And what we're going to do here is we're going to show a little bit about, some of those things you need to look at. And we'll also talk a little bit about the selection process here in a little bit too, and some of the things you need to focus on there. But again, keep in mind that cloud ERP is much, much different. So what you're seeing here is the first thing we usually suggest if someone's very early in the process is do a cloud readiness assessment. Look at the people, process, and technologies and really try to figure out, are we ready? And I'll just take a few examples here. Take the technology. Let's talk data. Whenever you do a cloud ERP implementation, one of the things that you have to do is you're going to have to convert data from your old system into your new. Okay. Now, traditionally, you would want to try to convert at least, let's say 13 months of summarized financial data, so you can do in the new system, a year-over-year comparison maybe of your financials. If you're doing planning type of implementation, you're going to have to convert at a minimum all your active employees. You're going to have to convert, a number of reference data sets, your item master from a procurement perspective. There's a lot of things that you have to convert over into the system. Where folks get in trouble is that maybe they have 10 years of data, or 15 years of data in their old system, and they want to convert all that over to the new system so they can turn the old one off. Well, that makes sense because they want to turn that old system off. The problem is when you're converting that much data, you're really just creating all kinds of additional work for your implementation. And when people convert data, they're going to have to recreate, in some instances, the reference data that surrounds that so it actually can be seen in the new system. So that's a lot of work And that's a lot of money in your implementation if you want to convert all that data into your new system. So one thing that we often look at is, well, take a look at whether or not you have a data lake or a data warehouse. Maybe it makes more sense. And again, part of the evaluation, maybe it makes sense to actually convert, 9 years of that 10 into a data lake where people can get access to the data. They can actually still do compliance type reporting, but you don't have to spend all of this money and time trying to convert data into a new system. You have what you need for ongoing ongoing processing your transactional system, but you're not going to weigh the implementation down with a significant ask, let's say of 10 to 15 years of conversion data. Okay, so that's one consideration as an example. So on the technology side, do you have a data lake? Do you have a data warehouse? What are you doing in that regards? And again, this can help you out from a higher education perspective, also from reporting on student success, things like that. Those same technologies you could use to help in that conversion process, you can also then use for other things going forward as well. People able and willing on a best practice business process, or are they stuck in their ways? So actually doing a change management survey and actually looking at, are people understanding what needs to happen from a process perspective? What are your pain points? What is the gaps to best practice? What's some of the compliance things that you have to do that maybe other institutions wouldn't have to do? So looking at those things, people, process, and technology is very important as you get ready for a move to the cloud. So you can try to mitigate some of the gaps that may exist before you actually get into the midst of an implementation. And I'll just give an example. In the cloud world, as soon as you sign a contract with a cloud vendor, and as soon as that infrastructure is provisioned, you're going to start paying for that software in that SaaS model, software as a service model. So you need to make sure a lot of this stuff is done in advance so that when that clock starts ticking, you're ready to start the implementation and get it going, because you don't want to be wasting, months and months and months doing this type of stuff, when you're still paying for the software, not actually doing the work of the implementation. Okay, so that's the first thing we would suggest. Now, there's different ways to get to the cloud, and you'll see listed here: rapid, optimal, traditional. They can be called different things by different vendors. I think Workday as an example would say launch versus my way or your way, excuse me. Oracle will call them something different, but the bottom line is there's different ways to get to the cloud. One of our successful implementations in higher ed, we're able to get folks to the cloud in a 9-month period. That was a rapid implementation of financial systems, of their HR systems, and it worked very well. But it's not for the lighthearted, because there was a lot of things that, it was difficult, because basically you're saying we're going to do exactly what best practice is. We're not going to do any type of changes to that. We're just going to basically completely transform. And again, in a lot of institutions, especially larger ones, the optimal is actually a little bit more, that hybrid is a little bit more realistic, where you get some configuration choices through the process. And again, it's what we typically recommend. So a rapid, maybe 9 to 12 months, optimal, maybe 12 to 15 type months, traditional 18 to 24 months. And again, from an implementation perspective, the costs go up for each one of them as well. So while you see some institutions saying we want to do a rapid implementation because we want to limit costs, there is a cost to that. And that is, you don't get the same flexibility on your configuration when you're doing your implementation. But again, it's a choice that you have to make, as an organization, of which path you want to go down. Now, we talked about this a little bit. Getting to the cloud, your implementation approach, you do it in prototypes. Okay, so it's an iterative approach to implementation. So you've heard probably of this agile type of implementation. where you basically do things in sprints and small pieces of functionality, what they call minimum viable functionality you're putting in. That's what Agile's built around. And then you have these waterfall, which is traditional implementation, where you take 9, 12 months and you see it basically at the end, here's what the project looks like, or here's what the software looks like. Well, there's sort of a hybrid of that with the cloud, where you're actually doing this iterative approach, where you're actually creating a prototype, you're talking about it. Okay, you're seeing if there's gaps, then you're go back, you change some of the configuration, you show another prototype. So first you may be 70% there, the next prototype may be 85% there, the next prototype may be 95% there, and then you're getting ready for that last build where you're getting ready to go into production perhaps. There may be 4 or 5 prototypes that you're going through over the course of an implementation. Again, much different than a traditional implementation, and much more focused on the functional interaction as a user, but it's important to know this as you start getting prepared for the cloud. Now, the other thing we wanted to show was, what does support look like after a go live for a cloud ERP software. So again, you're in a situation where you've, let's say, put the software in place. It's a functionally oriented implementation. What we're showing here on the screen is you see a line of what we call functional leads, okay? And those functional leads, when you look at it, and again, I'm going to show you real quick, let me spotlight this. This section right here, if you see my arrow, is basically what we call functional leads. These are individuals that are in a functional area. They're let's say an HR, functional person, but they have a technology bent. Okay, traditionally it may have been what you call an HRIS type individual, but our suggestion to most organizations is post go live, you really want someone in the HR space, in the payroll space, in the finance space, in each of your different areas that's focused on that particular, cloud ERP solution. So what they're doing is, in Workday's case, twice a year, in Oracle's case, 4 times a year, they're looking at the release notes for the release that's coming out. Is there additional functionality that's going to benefit as an organization? Is some of the subject matter experts in that area, are they struggling with something in the system? They can go to this individual for support and help. The bottom line is these individuals are going to be your key support people in your functional areas post go live. So that's our typical recommendation from a support perspective. Now, this picture you're seeing, okay, is really a matrix organization. So in other words, this isn't a separate org chart org, okay? So your HR functional lead is going to be in HR. Your payroll functional lead is going to be in payroll. Your project and program manager or change manager, they may be in an enterprise PMO, they may be in your IT department. The bottom line is those individuals are running those future projects, helping run the release testing, those type of things and activities. But again, they may not all be in the same organization. And then down here, at this second level of resources, you basically have what we call our technology team. So instead of having folks that are, server support, things like that, you have roles like reporting specialist or integration specialist, security specialist, someone that's responsible for the solution, administration. Again, different solutions will call these things different, things differently. They'll name the roles differently, but the bottom line is this is generally what you're going to see with a cloud ERP solution. Maybe in some organizations, this may be 2 people filling these 4 roles. In a larger organization, it may be 1 person for each. But the bottom line is this is the type of thing, that an IT shop will be doing going forward, supporting an organization. And let's call out reporting specifically. Your HR functional lead is going to do a significant amount of reporting on their own, as well as the functional users, because there's a lot of self-service in these cloud ERP solutions. However, what we're talking about there's those complex financial reports, let's say, that have to get built. Well, in those situations, you may need that additional help from a reporting specialist out of IT. So that's the idea of what we're talking about here. And then the last line you see on this is these certified consultants in the dark blue. And these are folks that, maybe they were part of your implementation. There's something typically called AMS support post go live, where you're live on the system. You may have a vendor that you have application management support from. So if this functional lead in HR runs into something that, hey, I don't really know how to do that, I'm not comfortable here, I can't figure it out, they have a lifeline or a consultant they can call and only get really charged for the hours they use, from that HR consultant. And oftentimes what we'll see is the folks that done their implementation, like so if Avaap did your implementation, then maybe these consultants may end up being the same individuals that are servicing your lifeline support. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about getting to that cloud, okay? So let's talk about then, when you have that view in mind of what that structure looks like at the end, okay, now let's talk about the structure during an implementation. So again, if you look at this, you notice here under each of the teams, and these are work streams, okay, so again, depending upon the way the project is organized, you may do a big bang, implementation, which means all of this functionality, finance, HR maybe is done at the same time, maybe students done in another phase, whatever. The bottom line is when you organize that, within each of these work streams, however, these functional leads that I have pointed to are the same ones that will be supporting at the end. So part of the implementation is for them to get up to speed with the software, to be working hand in hand with the Avaap certified consultants and actually having knowledge transfer during the implementation process so that when they're ready to go live, then they're ready to take on those support roles. And then underneath that, you have these subject matter experts. And again, organizationally, this isn't a reporting structure. When I say underneath that, they're supported individuals. So let's take payroll as an example. You may have a functional lead, that's going to support this long term. And let's say they're a payroll analyst that has a really gifted from a technology perspective, but they're not the payroll manager. They're not the person that does garnishment processing. And those SMEs will work with those functional leads during the course of the implementation for testing and different things like that. So the bottom line is this is what we're looking at for an implementation, typically when you're putting it together. Okay. Now, of course, up top here in an implementation, you're always going to have your executive sponsors and your steering committee. One thing you note here is a change agent network, and we'll talk a little bit about change management here in a moment of the importance in the cloud environment. You also notice this group over here, a policy and procedure committee. When you're coming to best practice business process, you're going to be challenging some of the current policies and procedures that are out there today, and you may need, depending on the size of your organization, you may need a group to get together to actually help drive some of that forward from a policy perspective to support, what the cloud ERP system is going to bring to bear. So again, this is sort of typically what we see on a cloud type implementation. All right. So let's go ahead and move forward. Again, if you have questions, again, feel free to put them out there, and we'll try to address this and make it as interactive as possible as we get to the back end of the presentation. So we talked a little bit about change management. You see a technical side of the implementation, you see a people side of the implementation. I think the big difference on the cloud side is when you're going to best practice, the people have to change what they're doing. And you can have the best technical implementation in the world and develop and design and deliver the best software in the world. But the bottom line is, if in this diagram here, if this human performance down at the bottom, if all of a sudden, no one's using it and that's zero, okay, what's going to happen is your results are going to be zero. Okay, so it's really, really important when you're doing an implementation like this. And again, I'll say probably any project actually, but even more so in cloud ERP, change management has to be a part of what you do It has to be integrated in with the project management. And again, one thing that we do at Avaap is just part of our DNA is product and change management are done together on projects. And we try to help build that capability within our clients as we move forward. Okay. All right, so let's, again, keep moving along here. All right, so one last slide on change management. This slide is really sort of telling, and I'll just describe it real quickly. This actually shows the correlation of those executive sponsor, executive access in meeting project objectives. The bottom line is sponsors have to be engaged, okay? So if your executive team's out there and they feel that, hey, we've initiated this project, we've went down this path, we've got this project team working on it, and they go off and do something else, things are not going to work well. What needs to really happen, and we sort of showed that in our org structure, is that steering committee and those sponsors need to be engaged during the entire implementation. And in some cases, they're sort of the cheerleaders of the why. They're telling people why we have to do what we're doing. And that's going to allow people to get past some of those change issues, maybe some of that resistance they might be having, and actually get on the same page to move forward. So that's why when you see this graph, it's so important for executive leaders to be part of the process. That may be going into design sessions and after it's done saying, hey, we appreciate everybody's being a part of this project team. We appreciate all you're doing. Writing notes, showing support for your team, making sure they understand that this is a priority, that you appreciate what they're doing, and the bottom line is it's something that's a priority for the organization. That's really vital for success. Okay. Now let's transition a little bit, and we're going to talk about selecting a cloud ERP solution. So again, we've talked about all the details of an implementation, what's different about the cloud, but how do you actually get and select a cloud ERP solution? Okay. Well, this is a standard process that we've put together at Avaap, and you'll see a number of different things, and we'll talk through each of these pieces of the process. But going from left to right, organizational alignment, creating a business case, creating that RFP that goes out and gets the responses back from vendors, doing the analysis and making a recommendation to your board or whoever makes those decisions in your organizations. And then lastly, that negotiation / contracting that has to occur with vendors. This whole thing, this whole process we've put together is typically what we see in a selection process. Now, again, some of our clients say that, hey, we don't need a business case. The bottom line is we know we have to do this. In some cases, private institutions, they don't necessarily even have to go through the RFP. So again, we have discussions with different folks, different ones of our clients to say, what parts of this process do you need to do? This is certainly suggested, but in certain cases, some of this work may have already been done. Some of it may not be needed. But again, we'll walk through each step in the process to give you an idea what we see each of these steps being and why it's important in the process. So first of all, let's talk about what I consider the most important component of the ERP selection process. And I'll say even part of the ERP project implementation. When we start a project, we're going to start with alignment. And the organizational alignment is really taking your strategic imperatives. What's your strategic plan say who you are and what you're trying to do? How does that translate to program and project objectives? And then what does success look like at the end? And again, in Avaap, in our experience, since we've done this with multiple clients over time, we typically go in and with a team, from the client will say, here's what organization 1 did. Here's what organization 2 did, with like say an opportunity statement or a vision statement or a tagline or that information with them and say, okay, how do we tweak this, or what applies to you, what doesn't apply to you, and we go through that entire process. So we bring a lot of knowledge capital to it, but the key is after we're done with the organizational alignment, we've defined what the project is, what's your vision, what's your scope, et cetera. We've planned it saying, here's what the implementation timeframe looks like. Here's how we're going to make decisions on a project. Is cost more important than scope? Is scope and quality more important than cost? Where does architecture fit? Maybe in the selection as well as in an implementation. Those are the type of discussions we have up front. So when we hear them within a selection or during an implementation, we can go back to those decisions and actually say, here's why we made those calls. Let's look at the risks that typically come up on a project. How are we going to mitigate those? Those are discussions that we would have in this alignment process, that we actually go into the implementation. This would feed a project charter for implementation, or this would feed a business case and an RFP, for what you want for your ERP solution, okay? So this is a really important component. If I don't emphasize anything more so than this is really beginning with the end in mind is vital for success when you're moving to the cloud, and actually, I would say, when you're doing any type of major project for your organization, okay? Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is the business case. So again, we've done our alignment. We've actually formulated the why, the what, the when. All that feeds into the business case. But we also then have to look at those costs. What is the cost of the implementation? What is the cost of software? And again, on the surface, you're going to see from a lot of vendors a huge differentiation in price for their software, okay? If you just make the evaluation just on that, you're going to be making decision A. But if all of a sudden you look at maybe what the value of each of those software solutions bring, then it basically is a completely different equation. So this return on investment is really not just looking at cost, but looking at the quality of an application and the benefits that application, the value that those applications are going to provide. And I'll give an example. Some of the next generation ERP systems out there, the ones we're talking about, are very, very solid at employee and manager self-service, which is something that traditionally wasn't a major part of traditional ERP solutions. You may have had some in your requisitions, et cetera, but you didn't necessarily have all your employees having access to almost everything. And that's what happens with the manager and the employee self-service with these next generation systems. And the bottom line is that translates to, instead of your HR department going and updating, all this stuff in an HR record, all they're doing is validating perhaps what an employee put in, and then they can focus their time on strategic things. Well, there's a value for that. And again, letting you see that information is a key part of this business case process, okay? The next thing, RFP creation. Again, that alignment, you've done your business case. Now you need to create this RFP that's going to go out to the vendors. And again, I've seen so many RFPs, and we've replied to RFPs that were very poorly written. There's some good ones out there, but there's some really bad ones too. And the quality of your RFP is going to dictate, in some cases, the quality of your proposal you receive. And let me give an example in the cloud ERP space. If I get an RFP that comes in and it has a list of 500 requirements that basically says, I want to continue doing business the way I've always done it, well, that goes contrary to everything we just talked about. You're no longer going to best practice business process. You just want to recreate what you're doing already. Well, why look for a system? So again, your RFP can't just dictate what you do today. What you want to do is you want to go in and say, what do we want to do? And then leave the vendor to actually respond to how you're going to be able to do that. So in that balance is what you really need to get to with an RFP. And it's really, really important. And part of this process also is not just creating that document, but how are we going to evaluate the responses? Are we going to do a dual tier approach, which is typical with a cloud ERP selection? In other words, get the RFP, come in, let's evaluate it. Let's get us down to when we do an analysis, we'll talk about in a second, let's get us down to, 2 or 3 vendors. And then from there, how are we going to evaluate those? Are we going to do presentations and demonstrations? Having that discussion is part of this art of creation is vital. Okay, so we have to basically do that and be prepared for it. Okay, and then again, we talked about this briefly, the vendor analysis and recommendations. Again, once you get the proposals in, you take that criteria you've been looking at and you're going to apply it across the board. And we have this nice step process, if you will, that we take these proposals through, with scorecards, et cetera. And again, your team at the end of the day is making decisions, but the bottom line is this helps in that process, all right? And then lastly, the last stage is the negotiation and contracting. And this is a stage where you really, in my opinion, having been a CIO for 13 years, this is where you need help. You don't know what you don't know. And the bottom line is if you're in a situation where you're sitting across the desk from a Workday or an Oracle and saying, they come back with a contract, or you're saying, here's what we want to do. They have standard contract language because everybody's in the same software. They have standard SLAs, but if you don't know what they do well and what they don't do well, where's the points where we can actually negotiate with them and where can't we? What's the business language that we need to do? These are vital things. And, in some cases, we've saved some of our clients multi-million dollars over the course of their contracts. I mean, approaching, I had one client's case, it was $9 million recently, over a 5-year contract that we saved them by going through this negotiation process with knowledge of what the vendor can do and what they can't do. Knowledge of when their period end is and when their year end is, so you can try to get the best pricing. These are all things that you have to consider when you're going into negotiation and contracting. Okay. So selecting a cloud ERP process overall, 28 to 40 weeks, and again, you'll see the phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 here, depending on the size of the organization, and how much of this work you may or may not have already done would dictate exactly how long something will take. But again, somewhere between 28 and 40 weeks, so you can calculate that out between 6 and 10 months. Somewhere in that time frame is what a typical cloud ERP selection process would take. Okay. Now, one last slide I'll cover with this, how can Avaap help? One of the things that really I would ask you to do is read through some of these key indicators. Is your current business process inefficient? You can read through this list. If any of these things are true, then really I think we could probably help you through the process. Now, again, we're not going to have a commercial. We want to get to your questions. But at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Lee, and I think he can take us quickly through a couple of slides about who we are. Again, we don't want to make it a commercial, but we want to take a few minutes to share who we are. But then I want to get to the Q&A so we can actually answer some questions that folks have out there. So Lee?
Sounds good. Thanks, Tim. All right, so quickly, this is just about Avaap in general. And some of you may know us as Navigator. We actually were acquired last summer and merged with Avaap. So there is a name change, but we've been around since 2001. Our consultant base, we've got over 600 consultants, and of those, 70% have worked on 5 or more higher ed projects. So we've got deep domain expertise in the higher ed space. In addition to that, we're a full service cloud implementation partner. We work with Oracle, SAP, Workday, and Infor in that area, in those areas. And then as well, we've got 97% client satisfaction. So that speaks to the quality of our work. And we can move on. The next slide is just representative of some of our clients. And again, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but it just shows you some of the organizations we represent. Many higher ed organizations represented there as well too. And then on this last slide, before we get to questions, this talks about our specific service offerings. And typically when we're doing a cloud implementation, some combination of all of these offerings are a part of that. And there are other circumstances where we'll come in and help a client from a strategy perspective, vendor selection. Tim was talking about that before, helping you negotiate and determine, get the organization ready to move to the cloud. And then also driving project program management. Organizational change management is a huge factor in moving to the cloud because it requires a tremendous amount of change for the organization, and typically changes in roles and processes the way things are traditionally done. So helping your people make that change is a big part of it. And then business process, business analysis, and then BI and data analytics as well too. Being able to visualize and see your data better, as well as solutions architecture. So that kind of touches on the different areas that we focus on. And then from there, I think we're going into questions. So we're going to turn it over to Vanessa. Vanessa, did any questions come in? But also, I was going to add, feel free at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. So if you have a question, you want to send it in, you can type it right in there and we can answer it.
Hey, Lee, we had a few questions come in. So the first one says, what is the most important thing an organization can do when getting ready for the cloud?
Okay. So I think this is Tim taking that. I think the most important thing that I think an institution can do getting ready for the cloud is really that, what I would call that cloud readiness assessment, is really looking and getting prepared both from a people, process, and a technology perspective along all those areas. You know, it's a little different than what's the most important thing in a cloud implementation. You know, I think that change management and getting people to, you know, come to a common best practice business process is key, but making sure that you have buy-in across the entire organization and you're analyzing and looking at those things you can do in advance, you know, to get ready, I think is really, really vital for success overall.
Thanks, Tim. All right, looks like we have another question. Is change management needed for a project if the university is small?
Yes, absolutely. Regardless of whether you're small or large, change management is a needed part of the process, because whether you have one person that's resisting a change or you have 15 people resisting a change, you know, the bottom line is the change management process or methodology would basically be the same. So where we see maybe a little difference between size of institutions, and I'll just throw this out. I mean, a lot of times when we approach things with our clients, we do what we call a collaborative model as far as our implementations are concerned. So in other words, we'll give folks options. In other words, if you know, we would bring a change strategist in and they would do a change strategy that says, here's all the things from a change perspective we need to do from a people side of a project that we need to accomplish. But then for a larger organization, they may have individuals that can perform the change leadership, or they can perform the communication management, or they can do the training plan. They may have individuals already that can do those type of things. And in those cases, our strategist almost becomes a coach for that team going forward. With smaller organizations, perhaps you don't have resources that are doing that, and we may have to bring someone on to do one or more of those things over time. So again, we call it a collaborative model, but the idea is to sort of meet you where you're at, and provide the resources you need to get to the end, but not provide more than you need if you already have folks that can do those things.
Great, thank you. And looks like we had another one just come in. Do you have a ballpark estimate of costs for an ERP replacement?
It varies by institution. And again, I'm not trying to get out of that, but I think, you know, we've seen ERP implementations from a software perspective, you know, that, you know, you can look at, you know, you can look at a 5-year cost of, you know, $2.3, $2.4 million. We've seen others, that larger institutions that are significantly higher than that. You know, what we typically try to do on this selection process, we have the typical formulas that the vendors use to basically price out their software. And we can usually, within the alignment process, give a pretty good ballpark of where your software is going to come in from a pricing perspective. And then from an implementation perspective, since we obviously, you know, implement all the solutions as well, you know, the bottom line is we can also provide implementation costs. And again, those vary. We see some that, you know, it's a couple $1 million implementation, you know, all the way, to some that are 20 million, depending upon the size of the organization. So again, and I'm not putting that high figure out to scare anybody. The bottom line is, there has to be a payback across this, and we all understand that. And again, but that variability is based upon the size of the organization and how much work really needs to be done. Usually you're well more toward the bottom of that. Again, I'll give an example. We had an organization we just helped out that, we had a $5 million implementation, that was out there. I think they had $2.3 million in their software spend. So I mean, the bottom line is all that can be mapped out. We just need to probably interact and actually get the variables in question. And it's all going to be focused around number of employees, number of contractors, part-time, full-time, et cetera, is all going to drive that price point, regardless of the vendor that you're working with. Okay.
Thanks, Tim. Looks like we had one last question come in. So if anyone else has any more questions, feel free to send them in while we answer this last one. So this person would like to know, in your experience, where have you seen institutions make the biggest mistake when implementing cloud software?
I think, what we've seen as the biggest mistake is folks that basically try to implement a cloud ERP solution like a traditional ERP software. And that's just not possible. Okay. So, and I'll focus this question like on an Oracle implementation. We've come in and had to help, vendors that have went askew because, they had an implementation partner that they came in and actually tried to do it the traditional way. Well, change management wasn't part of it. Challenging current practice and actually trying to get folks to best practice wasn't part of the discussions. Those are huge mistakes on a cloud ERP implementation, because as soon as you get into a situation where people are trying to do what they've always done, then you've lost the value that you're going to be getting from the software. And again, I gave an Oracle example. Workday in the same way. You may have a Workday implementation partner that staffs the project with folks that have always implemented Workday, have never implemented Workday, but actually done traditional implementations. Well, they're not used to doing it in a cloud way. And again, that goes across Workday or Oracle. If you have consultants that don't have the experience to do it, or you have partners that come in that don't have a cloud methodology, the bottom line is you're going to run into problems.
All right. Thank you so much, Tim. It looks like those were all of the questions that came in.
Okay. I certainly appreciate everybody joining and everyone's time. And hopefully everyone got something out of it. If there are other questions, feel free to send them in over time. We can try to get back to you.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks to everyone that joined today. It was a great session. And like Tim mentioned, if you have any questions or you want to talk to understand more about how to prepare your organization for the cloud, please reach out to Tim and me, and we'll get a conversation started. Also, there's a brief survey that we'd appreciate if you could take a minute to respond to and let us know other topics you'd like to hear about in the future. We also have another webinar tomorrow called How Much Change Management is Enough. So we talked quite a bit about change management today. Tomorrow's webinar is specifically focused on that and right-sizing your change management effort in higher education. You can register at avaap.com, which is avaap.com/events. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.